All right, let's get started. Welcome to our webinar titled The Geopolitics of NATO-Ukraine Integration. The reason for having this webinar is that NATO's relationship with Ukraine is the possibly most strategically consequential issue for European security now and in the future, but it's also one that NATO remains unable to resolve since it first brought up the membership issue in 2008. And NATO leaders at the recent Washington summit agreed that the alliance should coordinate the delivery of lethal aid to Ukraine. They also stressed the irreversibility of Ukraine's path to membership and outlined a number of activities as a bridge for how to realize this goal. But the reality is, at the same time, that allies are fundamentally wavering about the long-standing pledge to bring in NATO into the alliance. Ukraine's place in NATO or not is probably the most bewildering issue for Western capital when it comes to European security. This webinar, therefore, intends to debate the geopolitical circumstances for and against further integration between NATO and Ukraine during our next 90 minutes. Our panelists, our panel of experts to debate this important topic are in no particular order: Liana, Fellow for Europe at the Council of Foreign Relations, and also an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University. Then we have Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy at the CATO Institute. We have Tomas Janeliūnas, Professor of International Relations at the University of Vilnius, and also visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute. And we have, last but not least, Zach Paikin, Senior Fellow at the IPD and a Research Fellow as well at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. A few words about the IPD, Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. We are a North American international affairs think tank operating in Canada and the United States, dedicated to promoting ideas and policy solutions that support diplomacy, constructive engagement, and prudent realism in international affairs. The way I imagine I planned to structure this webinar is to follow the three main aspects of NATO-Ukraine integration, which we hopefully will then debate in turn. And the first element is the significance of NATO's decision to be in charge of lethal aid to Ukraine, which is definitely an upgrade compared to the non-lethal aid that NATO gave before. And then second, the wisdom and the viability of taking steps toward membership while Ukraine is at war. And third, Ukrainian NATO membership or not membership as part of the future European security architecture. For our online audience, it's possible to post questions in the chat, and we will try to take as many questions as possible in the last approximately 20 minutes of our debate. This event will be uploaded on YouTube afterward in an unedited version. But let's get straight into the first topic, lethal aid to Ukraine, NATO's decision at the Washington summit to coordinate this. It's definitely a step forward compared to what NATO previously had done in Ukraine, namely advisory and trust funds. But at the same time, NATO allies have committed to just 40 billion for the next year. And this 40 billion corresponds approximately to what allies are already giving. So I would like to discuss what is the geopolitical significance of this enhanced NATO role. I would like to give the first question to Mr. Logan. What effect do you think it might have on Russia's calculus that NATO is now officially coordinating the provision of weapons to Ukraine? Do you think that's something that would make Russia back down, or will Russia raise the stakes further as a consequence of NATO's decision?
I hate to give a boring answer, but I think it's not likely to have terribly much effect either way. President Putin, for better or worse, has felt since the war began that he is at war fundamentally with NATO and with the West. This will serve as another piece of evidence for him in that respect. But I think the reason it will have a limited effect on Russia is because I think it will have a limited effect on the battlefield. I think that we have had, in the context of talking about Trump-proofing NATO and Trump-proofing aid to Ukraine, housing this inside NATO was very much couched as a way to lock in the United States. And you've seen similar things in the United States here, where the Congress has passed a resolution saying a future president couldn't spend any money to withdraw the United States from NATO. But this is a weirdly legalistic way of thinking about these things. It wouldn't cost any money for Donald Trump to go up to a podium and say, I no longer think Article 5 should bear very heavily on U.S. foreign policy. And in a similar way, housing the distribution of lethal aid to Ukraine and NATO, were an American president to say, I don't think we should supply more aid, then yes, the NATO institution would be there, but there would be a real dearth of materiel to contribute to Ukraine's defense. So I think Russia's response will be limited because the battlefield effects will be limited.
I mean, if I respond to that, one of the arguments that is brought up is that Putin very much tried to sell this war domestically as a NATO war. Russia is at war not only against Ukraine, but against NATO. And now he actually has a reason to say that NATO is now directly involved in the provision of weapons. You don't see any domestic repercussions that this might have.
As I suggested, I think he will definitely use it for the purposes that you suggest, but he's been making that pitch all along to, I think, some effect inside Russia, right? I mean, the material reality is that Ukraine is in this fight still in large part due to NATO and Western supplied materiel. So whether it's done, formally through the vehicle of the United States or formally through the vehicle of NATO, maybe people disagree, but I'm not sure that will have a huge impact one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. Zach, I would like to put the same question to you. What symbolism, if any, do you think Russia sees in the NATO fund? I mean, as mentioned, it does fit the Russian narrative of being at war with NATO and not just Ukraine. What is your assessment of the situation?
Well, thanks, Henrik, very much for putting this discussion together today. A pleasure to meet you, Tomas, and nice to see Justin and Liana again. I agree very much with what Justin's just said. I mean, Russia has long believed that it is directly at war with NATO. That's part of the reason how it's been able to explain that it didn't win the war in just 3 days. So in terms of Russia's perceptions, I don't think this move by NATO is going to change very much. It's also a very convenient framing for Russia, because claiming that they're at war not against Ukraine, but rather against NATO allows them to put forward this idea of Russia and Ukraine being, one people. We're not at war against our brotherly Ukrainians. It's really the West that's getting involved here. We're at war for our survival against the West, for our security against the West, and it's the West that's imposed this sort of false Ukrainian regime in Kiev. So that's the narrative that Russia has been parroting for quite some time. So I don't think that this move is really going to change anything from a fundamental perspective. And even without the coordination directly by NATO, I think that it is undeniable that this is in effect a conflict between NATO and Russia on the territory of Ukraine over the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine, which is significant to the balance of power in Europe in general, given that Ukraine's a relatively large country. It's also a battle between NATO and Russia over the future rules that will shape the European security system, including whether or not spheres of influence are legitimate, whether or not countries have the right to choose their security arrangements freely. So this is a nested conflict. There is a Russo-Ukrainian dimension to the conflict, but that dimension is very much nested within a NATO-Russia confrontation that is present, and it serves no purpose for us to deny that reality. So, in terms of Russia's perceptions, I don't think this changes much. In terms of maybe signaling NATO resolve, as Justin was saying, Trump-proofing NATO assistance to Ukraine. Maybe there's something on that front that it could do, but in order for that to really signal NATO's resolve, I think that Western support for Ukraine would have to be far more significant than it currently is. And right now, Russia thinks that time is on its side. So unless there is something dramatic that fundamentally causes Russia to alter that calculation, I don't see Russia's perceptions changing much as a result of this latest move.
Okay, thank you. Then the next question to Liana Fix, or it's not the next, it's actually the same question, but looking instead from the Ukrainian side. To what extent do you think NATO taking responsibility for lethal aid is a morale booster for Kiev in its struggle against a much stronger enemy? I mean, the fund in itself is not going to, what is promised now is not going to change much on the battlefield. But maybe there's a hope in Ukraine that this fund might be, allies will chip in with more money maybe, and it might therefore make a difference for them.
Yeah, I think from Ukraine's side, there's a lot of disillusionment with NATO. So I wouldn't say that the step to provide lethal aid directly is actually something that boosts Ukraine's morale, because what Ukraine has realized with the Vilnius summit and with the Washington summit now is that NATO, and especially the big member states, United States and Germany, are not willing to change the inherent ambiguity that they have in their relationship with Ukraine. The ambiguity goes back to the Bucharest summit in 2008 when Ukraine and Georgia were promised membership, but were not given a timeline nor security guarantees that would have protected them on that way. And although NATO and Western partners are providing Ukraine with military goods, they're still afraid to articulate a timeline for Ukrainian membership. They have taken away the membership action plan as a roadmap for Ukraine to join, but they have not provided an alternative roadmap for Ukraine. And so from Ukraine's side, I think it's pretty clear, and they see this pretty clearly, that NATO membership from their perspective, regardless of whether lethal aid comes directly from NATO or not, is something that NATO at the moment doesn't want to approach, and from my perspective, at its own peril, because this timeline phobia that we see within NATO creates an ambiguity and a gray zone that can only encourage Vladimir Putin. There's this argument that we cannot give Ukraine a timeline, the West cannot give Ukraine a timeline, because if Vladimir Putin thinks Ukraine will become a NATO member, if the war ends, he will never end the war. This argument has become a truism in Western debates, but unjustly so. Vladimir Putin already now thinks that Ukraine will become a NATO member whatever happens. So he will certainly not think that even if NATO members do not formally agree to a timeline for Ukraine, this can sort of serve his purposes. And then on the other hand, he might also not be willing to end this war at all, regardless of Ukraine's NATO membership perspective or not. So the ambiguity, the insecurity that this kind of gap provides in the European landscape is a peril not only for Ukraine, but also for NATO. NATO has been the actor that has provided security in Europe, and certainly too early to give Ukraine a membership perspective now. There's no way that Article 5 could apply to Ukraine at the moment, but there are many reasons to give Ukraine a timeline, which, for example, could look like if a ceasefire is established, if the front lines have been stabilized, if buffer zones have been established on both sides of the front line, then a Ukrainian membership timeline, as well as Western guarantees or even Western troops in Ukraine are
if we leave the question of membership to the next part of the debate,
yeah,
do you think there's anything in the fund?
Just add two parts to that, because I think that relates to the NATO perspective. I think I would disagree a little bit with the framing that Zach provides, because it makes it sound like a proxy war between NATO and Russia being fought about Ukraine, and I don't think that's what the sequence of events actually supports. NATO would have never gone to war for Ukraine from NATO's perspective. Euro-Atlantic integration has always been a very inherent Ukrainian wish, and we should not underestimate Ukraine's agency here. It is about Ukraine's wish to join NATO, but also to join the European Union. So in sort of just in the timeline of events, this has not been a proxy war that was started about Ukraine, but it is a war that has been started by Russia to crush Ukraine's agency and Ukraine's political willingness to join the West. That's how I would frame it. And against this backdrop, I think Ukrainians are very clear about the role that NATO can play, and it's not something that they are encouraged now by lethal aid coming from NATO directly. I think the disillusionment, especially with the Washington summit in Kiev, has been very real, and also the disappointment with Eastern European allies, and not only Eastern European allies, but also France, who would have wished for a much stronger outcome of this historic Washington summit than what we have seen in the end.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Zach, do you want to respond to the question about proxy war and Ukraine agency quickly before I move to Tomas Janeliūnas for the next question?
Sure. Very briefly, just to say that I don't think there's anything that I said that denied that Ukraine had any agency. I simply stated the fact that this is a nested conflict, that there is the reality that there is a Russo-Ukrainian dimension to it. But we can't deny the NATO-Russia or Russia-West dimension to it as well. All of it is true that Ukraine has a government that wants to join the West. We should, broadly speaking, support those aspirations so long as they contribute to enhancing European security rather than undermining it. But I think that this emphasis on Ukrainian agency, and look, Ukrainian agency is a fact. I'm not denying it. Ukraine has a government that is agentic, that takes decisions, etc. But this overemphasis on Ukrainian agency, I think, in Western policy circles, leads to an outsourcing of Western governments' foreign policies to Ukraine to the point where, we end up, abandoning our own responsibility for strategic thought and for putting the security of our own citizens first as well. So the idea that we can, supply all these weapons and we don't have a say over, the outcome of this war, even when it's our own security that's involved, I think is a dangerous insinuation. Not that Liana was necessarily making that insinuation, but I think that there are dangers to overemphasizing this issue of agency, in part because the NATO dimension, as both Justin and I made clear, is very much present in the Kremlin's mind. It serves no purpose to deny it. And at the end of the day, international relations are intersubjectively constructed. So if Russia perceives a security threat, that's all that really matters. Arguing over how real that security threat is irrelevant. Perceptions are key.
Right, thank you. Professor Janeliūnas, the same question to you as to Liana. Is the NATO fund a morale booster for Kiev? It is an open-ended commitment, which I think is positive for Ukraine. But if I may add on a pessimistic note, what NATO did in Afghanistan was a similar open-ended commitment, and we know how that ended. So but maybe you have a more optimistic outlook on how NATO's open-ended wording might play out.
Yes, hello, Henrik. I would say I would not be optimistic about this decision by NATO. I see this NATO decision as a tactical or simply as a management issue. Of course, this probably should help move weapons to Ukraine faster, even if the United States suspends its assistance. But however, the bigger political and strategic question, I think, is whether European states, the EU, European Union, and other NATO members are ready to compensate for any potential suspensions of United States aid. What is long-term commitment by the NATO side, and what long-term commitments should NATO adopt and implement? Implementation is key, I think. When it comes to providing about 40 billion euros from NATO countries to Ukraine, it must be practical and must be backed by actual weapon systems. And there's also the issue of timely manufacturing of critical systems like air defense and long-range artillery. We all understand that this commitment will not change much in the current situation, especially if all those limitations, how to use long-range artillery or missiles, is not changed. So I'm totally agree that if this political or let's say some tactical move to coordinate the lethal aid to Ukraine by NATO would change anything in the battlefield, of course, Ukrainians would be much more happy and much more optimistic about that. But when it comes only just to a kind of, excuse why NATO is not engaging much more into this war, so far for Ukrainians, there's only just another excuse or just another decision which will not change a lot in the field. So the bottom line is that NATO continues to support Ukraine, but that doesn't mean a stronger and growing NATO engagement in Ukraine.
Thank you. I would like to throw the ball back to Justin Logan and ask, the latest package of $60 billion is a small amount. So the US Congress, what it approved after quite some delay and quite some debate, it was uncertain whether it would arrive at all. This amount, if you talk about what Janeliūnas said, about we need to beef it up with actual capability, this amount is small compared to the multi-trillion losses the West and NATO had in Afghanistan and Iraq. So how do you explain the US hesitation with chipping in this relatively modest amount that pales a little bit compared to the trillions that were spent / wasted in the greater Middle East?
Yeah, I think it, as somebody who wasn't a fan at all of the monstrous waste of human life and trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan, my first instinct is to say it reflects learning. It also reflects scarcity. The United States has a $35 trillion national debt. Its budget deficit each year is about $1.5 trillion. And the scarcity has been absent from American strategy really since the end of the Cold War. But strategy is ultimately about choice. So I think we're in a very uncomfortable territory where there's a whole generation of people who are making policy for the United States that have lived in this kind of unipolar fantasy land where we could have more guns and more money and NATO expansion and China containment and trying to patrol the Middle East and perhaps transform its internal politics. And now all of a sudden there's a sense of scarcity, right? There's this sense that American ambition in the world and American resources are out of balance. American strategy is insolvent. And I think that's basically correct. But the question is whether you want to trim your sails in terms of your ambition in the world or somehow conjure up hundreds of billions of dollars per year more resources. And I think, we had this typical discussion about Ukrainian agency. I certainly don't fault the Ukrainians for having unlimited interests in their own country, right? If we were being invaded by China or Cuba or something, there wouldn't be any expense that I would spare. But Ukraine and the United States are fundamentally different countries. They have fundamentally different interests, and the U.S. has an interest in Ukraine, but it's a limited interest that has called forth a limited investment that has produced Ukraine's survival against a much larger, much more powerful neighbor. And that's nothing to sniff at. But the idea that the United States has not sort of done everything Ukraine has asked for the moment Ukraine has asked for it, to my mind, gets things sort of reversed, right? It is, after all, called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that we're now having a discussion about Ukraine. And I think, even to look at the Washington Treaty itself, if you had told not just George Kennan, but anybody at the dawn of the Cold War that we would be talking about helping Ukraine fight Russia, or indeed potentially bringing Ukraine into NATO, I think to a person, all of those people would have thought that we were in some sort of bizarre ideological fit of pique. So I think there is a U.S. interest in Ukraine. That interest is limited, and that limited interest has produced limited investment.
Thank you. I would like to put the next question to Liana Fix, and responding to Justin. And since you have also some interest in Germany, I think we could maybe elaborate on the scarcity issue from the German perspective. I mean, we know over the summer, Germany has shocked many Western observers, first by saying they would halve military aid for Ukraine, and now they are saying we will not commit more military aid because we need to reduce to cover our deficit. If Germany is representative of Europe, what does that prove about Europe's real commitment to European security in your view?
Thanks so much, Henrik. Just to come back to one point Zach mentioned, I don't want to make this a back and forth between Zach and me because we can do this over coffee, but just to respond to that, I think from my perspective, there cannot be an overemphasis on Ukrainian agency because Ukrainians are dying, Ukrainians are being the victim here, Ukrainians are fighting the war. And I don't entirely believe that Western countries are actually outsourcing, or that we are at risk that Western countries would fully outsource their foreign policy or the security interests to Ukraine and just subordinate it. I mean, this is the United States. It's the hegemonic power in the world. The United States will certainly not let its foreign policy priorities be driven by Ukraine. There's large alignment of foreign policy interests between Ukraine and the United States, but there's also disagreements, and those disagreements are very clear to those who are following it closely. The United States is also very open in communicating these disagreements, long-range strike weapons, and you say the same with European countries. So I think I wouldn't overstate Ukraine's power there. To the contrary, Ukraine has struggled and struggled and struggled again to receive what it needs from Western partners. So the power dynamic is certainly, from my perspective, vice versa there. But coming to the question now, to have Europeans become wobbly or become tired with the signals that we see from Berlin. These signals from Berlin, and I'm not only interested in Germany, I'm actually German myself, are quite worrisome. But the problem is that the effects that these signals have is a greater problem than what it actually means domestically for Germany's foreign policy. So the discussions about reducing Ukraine aid are only coming from the domestic budgetary constraints that German politicians are discussing right now. It is not a change in foreign policy of Germany. The foreign policy and the priorities have remained the same, but the three-party coalition in Berlin is in a survival mode to the extent that they are fighting with the other two coalition partners about every euro in this budget. And that is why there was this kind of easy solution found now that there is a G7 vehicle of 50 billion to Ukraine, although it's not yet established, that in the future, the bilateral contributions from Germany's side would not be that necessary. One can argue that it reflects a downgrading of priorities, that Ukraine support is not anymore the sacred thing in German budgeting. But as always, domestic politics, if it becomes very tough in domestic politics and the survival of the governing coalition in Berlin is something which is a tough issue, then of course everything else becomes a less important priority. So I would not interpret a change in Germany's foreign policy position there, but I do think we see something of a wait and see moment in Europe right now. So Europeans had the impression that with the NATO summit, with the G7 summit in July, they've done everything they could from proofing Ukraine support by bringing it under the NATO umbrella, establishing the G7 lifeline for Ukraine, that from now on, one just has to wait and see what the outcome of the US elections will be. And this kind of wait and see approach I don't think it's great for Europe. Europe should show much more agency, and we've seen in the past that Europe had in past conflicts much more agency. I mean, I certainly don't want to see the 2008 scenario repeated, where French President Sarkozy traveled first to Moscow, negotiated a ceasefire, and then presented it to Saakashvili, the Georgian president at the time, as a fait accompli. We are very different in different times right now, but Europeans are leaning back too often and waiting for the United States too often to act. And that's the case where we are now with the US elections. And Ukraine, on the other hand, is sort of not just waiting for the US elections, but they're trying to actively shape the debate in the United States and in Western countries by providing successes with the Kursk offensive. One can debate to what extent it has been a success, but it has certainly been something that is unexpected, that is new, and that has dominated the headline in Ukraine's favor, and thereby influencing the debate in the US and in Europe.
Thank you. I would like to put the next question to you, Tomas, maybe also responding to the agency issue. What is your perception? Has Ukraine too much agency over the European governments and the US government? I mean, the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries where you're from, they contribute in relatively high numbers. And also, the European Commission is trying to make member states chip in with more money to Ukraine. But the countries are too small, and the Commission doesn't have enough money to change the situation on the battlefield. What's your situation of the agency discussion?
Yeah, this is a very, very crucial question, I think. Talking about the quite different approach from Baltic or the Nordic states, of course, it differs from France or German's positions. At least in the sense how much we are worrying about this and how much we are ready to spend on our own defense and on the aid to Ukraine. But let's be realistic. Neither the Baltic nor the Nordic states can turn the tide of their own. As long as Germany, France, and other major EU countries maintain the current stance, Ukraine cannot hope to regain the initiative in this war. In the Baltic states, we are living in a pre-war reality. It's no longer about boosting our welfare like in peaceful times. And politically, it's not easy decisions at all. Our governments prioritize defense spending over economic growth, political popularity, and all other concerns. Take Estonia, for instance. Despite 2 years of economic recession, it continues to increase defense spending. Why? because no economic growth will matter if Russia wins in Ukraine and then Putin sets his sight on testing NATO's resolve. So that's why we also were supporting this discussion about the agency of European Union and of European countries in general, to say just to take more responsibility, of course, by aiding Ukraine in much bigger numbers and much stronger political affection for Ukraine, but also being more serious about the consequences if we what we can face, especially such countries like Baltic states, what consequences could be if we are not serious enough about this war in Ukraine. And of course, I can understand, as Justin said, and Liana about these priorities given for Ukraine. When it comes to domestic issues, when it comes to election period, of course, there are many more issues you should discuss with your supporters, and Ukraine just stays behind all of it. It is not the case in our region, and I wish just to translate also some feelings which we are holding here back in the Baltic states. Let's say in Lithuania, we have national elections this year as well. In October, it's a parliamentary elections in Lithuania. And as I'm following the mass media in Lithuania, I see that during the summer, much more attention is given to the election of president in United States than to the national elections in Lithuania, because our people also understand that the outcome of the presidential elections here in the United States could be much more impactful on how we can feel secure in the nearest future. So, and this relates to the European agency as well, how Europeans, how Germans, how French are acting, and how they are giving more or less attention to this war, because on this depends how we will feel secure or not.
Thank you. Justin, Zach, do you want to both react to the agency discussion? Isn't it just a question of where you are geographically, actually? So if you're from a Baltic country, you feel the Russian threat much more closely. So, and if you're in Washington, not so much. It's more a question of more abstract issues like the global order that is at stake for those who believe in that. If you
don't have to, we don't have to bring the liberal international order into this. I think that's going to make us go off the rails. No, I think your question of the map, I mean, there's been this great effort to try to ask, why doesn't Washington behave with the sense of threat that Poland or Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia behaves? And I think the question fairly answers itself, right? You pointed to the map, and I think the explanation that economic growth doesn't mean a lot if you've been swallowed by Russia is perfectly accurate. And I think that makes sense why the Balts and particularly Poland would prioritize defense in the way that they have. However, there are a lot of countries that are saying highfalutin things about Ukraine that appear in their budgetary allocations to care more about balancing the budget than they do about this historic, unprecedented threat to the stability of Europe as a continent. And I think, we've been guilty of that ourselves in Washington as well. And I think we want to call out that inconsistency and ask ourselves, if a country keeps imploring the United States to do more, but isn't doing more for itself, what does it really believe about the nature of the threat? That is to say, if Washington doesn't do what that country wants it to do in terms of providing arms to help Ukraine win this war, maybe we're being played a bit here.
Zach, I see you very much wanted to say something.
Yeah, just very briefly. Look, all states have agency. That is a fact of international relations. I don't think it's a particularly fascinating fact. It's just a fact. All states have agency. The fact that Ukrainian agency is constantly being emphasized in discussions in policy circles in Washington, I think serves a particular purpose. It is to argue, as we've heard in this panel, that Ukrainians are the ones who are doing the dying, and therefore there can be no compromise. They're the ones who decide when the fighting ends. There can also be no compromising on, their aspirations to join the Western political and security community, which is bizarre because we're not prepared to offer Ukraine membership in the first place. So we're effectively continuing to enable a war over the principle that Ukraine should have the right to join NATO, even though we're not prepared actually to offer that membership ourselves. The problem is by saying that Ukraine and Ukraine alone gets to decide when the fighting ends, we end up in a situation where Ukraine has every incentive to escalate this conflict because they can only win this conflict if they bring the West directly in. And so that means that it won't just be Ukrainians that are going to be doing the dying, but Western citizens might be doing the dying as well. I hope it shouldn't have to get that far before we get a say over the contours of how this war ends. And of course, any ceasefire agreement or cessation of hostilities of some kind is going to have to be accepted by the Ukrainian side. It takes two to tango, and the two belligerents won't stop fighting unless they both agree to stop fighting. But that's just another truism, right? I think that this emphasis on overemphasis, I should say, on agency is not to deny that we, of course, in the West, maintain strategic autonomy. Of course, we maintain our strategic autonomy. We've not entirely outsourced our foreign policy, but the overemphasis does come with its dangers because it does not, allow us to underline really the stakes that are present in this conflict right now. We have an interest as well, and it is not in the maintenance of this conflict or the perpetuation of this conflict ad infinitum, because if it does, the incentive structure of the conflict does not favor the preservation of the security of our own citizens.
All right, thank you. I would like to turn up the heat a little bit of this debate by bringing in the NATO membership issue while Ukraine is at war, and then going into the second part of our debate today. Many public intellectuals suggest that NATO should agree on concrete steps toward NATO membership, and some even have a concrete timeline that you wanted, Liana. There's Rasmussen Global that have said Ukraine needs to be member at the latest July 28th. This is the timeline they have put out. But at the same time, the reality is that none of the proposals for a direct NATO fighting role in Ukraine have come true. So I have the Baltic idea of a no-fly zone, the Polish idea of a peacekeeping mission, and French President Macron's idea of sending troops to Ukraine. None of these are coming true, it looks like. So the question, what should NATO do when you have these pundits saying one thing and the policymakers not doing that? And the first question goes to you, Liana, and you wrote a very timely article in Survival that I would like to bring into the debate here. If I paraphrase you correctly, you say that NATO should frame membership explicitly as integral to ending the war. And that's an interesting argument, probably very controversial. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit what timeline and which criteria would be conducive for this to happen in practice.
Thanks so much. I've spilled some of the beans in my answer before, but I'll try to recap again. Just a quick point on sort of the escalation dynamic. I think if the only aim of Ukraine would have been to draw Western countries in and to have a NATO-Russia escalation and war to its benefit, I think that would already have been happened, and I don't think this is a fair assessment of Ukraine's interest there. Those incidents where we had a scenario of potential NATO-Russia confrontation, a misguided missile into Poland, and so on. Those scenarios have been handled very carefully and very reasonably, also from Ukraine's side. So I would not agree with that assessment. But coming to the membership perspective, I don't think it's so controversial to think about it. The problem is that we have given ourselves especially the US administration here has given some framework of how to think about NATO's Ukraine membership. And as I said, this truism that a timeline for NATO membership is not possible because otherwise the war will not end is just a truism that I think we have to challenge. The problem with ending the war and with entering into talks or any kinds of negotiations is that we lack the means of compelling Russia into doing this. And the strategy in the past was with military power and military strength, we can bring Russia to the negotiation table and make sure that it is willing to do compromises, because so far what we've only heard from Russia was how it can continue to control Ukraine through an outcome of negotiations. So that's the missing part of all of our discussions on talks and negotiations. How can we tell Russia to come to the table, not just to put into writing its control over Ukraine, but to actually see a benefit in making compromises. And part of this compelling strategy and part of sort of how to convince Russia should be the NATO membership perspective for Ukraine. In the long term, it is actually more stable for Russia to have a western part of Ukraine in NATO, because this would secure a safe, and certainly not with a leader like Vladimir Putin, but thinking in the long-term future with other Russian leaders, Ukraine in NATO would actually be safer, not only for Ukraine, but also for Russia in a long-term perspective, because NATO and Russia have, because of their mutual deterrence, have always been in a stable relationship with each other. And this is stability we have not seen in all the other parts, which are not NATO parts. And so the argument is, if we want to achieve a ceasefire, if we want to move towards talks, NATO membership has to be an instrument. And from a Western and European perspective, NATO membership is obviously not possible in a warlike situation. It's not possible for as long as the fighting goes on. But in a situation where the ceasefire has been established and the West Germany model, as criticized and as sort of not comparable in all aspects, and it is an example for that. Once we have a ceasefire, once we have stabilized front lines, a membership for everything of Ukraine, which is sort of west of the front lines, of the stabilized front lines, is something that can make sure that this war will not break out, that Russia will be deterred from attacking Ukraine again, whereas as of now, Russia is not deterred. Any future leader will still see it as it's probably his goal to bring Ukraine into Russia's hegemonic embrace. And this sort of the combination of a ceasefire with a prospect for NATO membership to stabilize the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is something that we should not take off the table. It's something that is a part of the solution, and it's not part of the problem.
Okay, thank you. I see Justin and Zach very much like to come in, but before I give you the word, I would like to bring in Tomas. And I think your argument is closer to Liana's. You argued in a recent commentary that NATO should extend an invitation to Ukraine, and then the membership could come into effect once the security situation has stabilized. So this would supposedly deter Russia, but how do you see the escalation risk? How do you see, isn't that a thing that NATO, as proven by its actions, non-interference, doesn't want to get into?
Well, first, let's talk about the reality. While the Baltic states and Poland argue that Ukraine's long-term security depends on NATO membership, this still is a minority view within the alliance. And other decisions like the NATO-Ukraine Council or joint training centers, all those decisions aren't real steps towards membership. They are just another excuse to avoid offering Ukraine an invitation to join NATO. And for some Western politicians, Ukraine's potential NATO membership could even become a bargaining chip in future peace talks with Russia. Many Western leaders are still hoping that these talks will end the war once and for good. In my view, and I share the dominant position of Lithuanian policymakers, I guess, any ceasefire or peace deal that leaves Ukraine without a clear path to NATO would only strengthen Russia, and that's all. Even now, Russia is building new military factories and speeding up missiles and artillery production. Their rearmament is outpacing all NATO countries. And we know that they will use these weapons again sooner or later. So Russia doesn't continue war because Ukraine's NATO membership is uncertain. The Kremlin proceeds with the war because it can. And Putin's ultimate goal, I think, it's to strip Ukraine of its sovereignty, and this would be much easier if Ukraine remains outside NATO. To be honest, I'm skeptical about any further progress towards NATO membership for Ukraine. We have already used almost every possible incremental step. And some experts suggesting inviting Ukraine, but delaying the full membership or integrating them into NATO structures without granting membership. So, but all these ideas are meaningless if political leaders remain paralyzed by fear of escalation. So I think that this dominant fear of escalation prevents any rational discussion about the timeline of the NATO membership, or even some reasons and some causes why it is needed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to bring in Justin into the debate. You had a reaction to.
Sure. I just wanted to correct one thing that was said previously, which pertained to the Ukrainian missile that landed in Poland and killed Polish citizens. That Zelensky was characterized as having handled that very carefully. That's the opposite of how Zelensky handled it. He asserted confidently that it was a Russian missile, pointing to it as a Russian escalation, and pointing explicitly at NATO and at Article 5. Now, he either was ignorant and didn't know that it was in fact a Ukrainian missile, or he knew that it was a Ukrainian missile and blamed it on Russia nonetheless in an effort to rope the United States into the conflict. He's called for multiple times for a Western no-fly zone over Ukraine at a time when Russian fighter planes were bombing Ukraine. I don't fault Zelensky for wanting the United States to get into the war. That might be what I would do if I were Zelensky. But as an American, and this gets into this never-ending agency discussion, I don't want the United States to fight Russia over Ukraine. I agree with President Biden. I agree with candidate Trump that there is no reason, no interest, U.S. interest in Ukraine that warrants the United States going to war with Russia over. And so it's just very important for us to get these things right. And I think this is, again, reflective of the fact that Ukraine has different interests than the United States does. As to offering it an irreversible path or a bridge that can't be bombed or what have you into NATO, I think this is an incentive for President Putin to continue the war forever. If we say once the war is over or once there are defensible, firmly established lines, then we'll have a West Germany scenario where we can see where the lines are. I think that is an incentive to continue the war forever. And if I think if we were to bring Ukraine into NATO, that commitment would be inherently incredible, because you have the United States, again, both political parties have said we won't go to war with Russia over Ukraine, then making a paper commitment to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, right? Article 5 has this Janus face where on the front end, everyone assures us, oh my goodness, it doesn't say anything. It only says in accordance with member states' constitutional processes, an attack on any member shall be treated as an attack on itself. But that leaves plenty of room for deliberation about what the response would need to be in any case. And then once a country is itself a NATO member, NATO members come to the United States and say, hey, look, either Article 5, either it means you'll go to war for us, or else your credibility is going to collapse in the context of NATO and all around the world. And again, I don't fault anyone for behaving this way. It's perfectly rational. But I think from the US point of view, we expanded NATO in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And if you look at the Senate hearing on the 97 round of expansion, but particularly on the 2004 round of expansion, there was no debate about how militarily to bring the Baltic states to a defense standpoint in comportment with NATO standards that could be defended against Russia. And I think that is just the most profound abrogation of an ethic of responsibility at the highest level of high politics. We're talking about nuclear war. And this was all waved off, and the debate, in the most superficial American way possible, was about the Balts sent people to Iraq, therefore we should make them NATO members. Whether we should make them NATO members or not, there should have been a discussion about the hard material questions about what the United States and other NATO members were willing to do and indeed could do. And that's why after the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, the Balts understandably came to the United States and said, hey, we should probably come up with a NATO defense plan for our countries, because after all, look what just happened in South Ossetia. And it was until 2010, 6 years after those countries' membership in NATO, that NATO drew up even a superficial plan for their defense. So I would just urge this: if it's serious business on the back end, it needs to be treated as really serious business on the front end. And if past is prologue, we're not very good at that.
Okay, thank you. Zach, please.
Yeah, so as was said already on the panel by people on the other side of this debate, Russia will likely, whether under this leader or under a subsequent leader, want to maintain some kind of influence over Ukraine. What that precisely looks like, who knows? But that's just the reality. And we've seen so far over the course of the past several years that Russia's prepared to go to war over Ukraine's orientation, and that we're not. So I don't know what incentive that actually gives us to be able to say, oh, yes, we're going to bring we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO at the end of this somehow. Even if you put the national issue aside, and by the national issue, I mean this idea of national and spiritual unity between Russia and Ukraine. And that's not a small issue in Russian political and social discourse. That's a pretty huge issue. That's not a foreign policy issue. That's a domestic issue for Russia. Even if you put all of that aside, you cannot tell a great power what its interests are fundamentally. So this idea that we could somehow tell the Russians that it is somehow in their interest to allow Ukraine to go into NATO because this would somehow stabilize the front line between NATO and Russia, when Russia went to war and cited as its casus belli in the lead up to the war through these draft treaties that we saw in late 2021, that preventing Ukraine's entry into NATO was one of its main grievances, one of the main issues that it was interested in seeing resolved. There's absolutely no way that at the end of this process that Ukraine can be brought into NATO and Russia will be saving face, right? So if we continue to maintain this fiction that we're going to be bringing Ukraine into NATO, we are providing Russia with an incentive to keep fighting forever. And as I mentioned before, that's not a recipe just for perpetual war between Russia and Ukraine. Given the incentive structure that Ukraine has, that is a recipe for escalation, and a very dangerous one across the entire continent. We need to keep that in mind, and we're not talking about that enough.
I would like to give the word then to Liana and Tomas. Maybe you would like to elaborate on. Let's bring the Russia agency. Now we talk about Ukraine agency. So the Russia agency, what kind of escalation do you think Russia would do if these steps towards membership would be taken? I mean, I can think of nuclear escalation or threats thereof, or a general mobilization. Do you think any of these can be excluded?
I can start a little bit reacting on this. So I think that fear of escalation is Putin's favorite toy, and he plays it masterfully. The Russians can sense this fear in Western capitals, and they know exactly how to exploit. Let's say in classic deterrence strategy, there's one basic principle: don't show that you are afraid of potential escalation or military engagement. We know it. Our political leaders know this, and yet we continue to do the exact opposite. So is there a risk of escalation? Absolutely. This is a high-stakes game of strategic risk. But instead of standing firm, we signal that we are ready to fold at the very first hint of danger. Personally, I believe the risk of nuclear escalation is very low. From military perspective, there are very few situations where nuclear weapons would make more sense than conventional ones. So any decision to use them would be political, just simple political, a desperate, radical choice. And in my view, unless Putin's regime feels an existential threat, it won't resort to nuclear weapons. What makes me wonder is why Western leaders are so hesitant to use the risk of escalation as a deterrent strategy against Russia. Why not, at the very least, use political escalation, like immediately accepting Ukraine into NATO, as a way to shift this balance? Because right now we are clearly losing this deterrence game.
Thank you. Liana, do you have a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if we look back since the beginning of the war, of how Russia has reacted to various moves, from Kiev not falling, to Ukraine fighting back, to Ukraine's counteroffensive in the summer of 2022, to Ukraine's counteroffensive now in Kursk, we see that our debates about red lines in Russia are very much debates that we have about ourselves, and less about what actually Russia's red lines are and what our concerns about escalations are, what our assumptions are about international politics in general, about our own fears and concerns. Because the red lines that Russia actually has is not something that we can define. It's something that we, in the best of our assessments, can arbitrarily look at, but there has never been a clear formulation of red lines from the Russian side that has not changed. We have seen these red lines changing from the beginning of the war, and this does not mean that there's no final red line from Russia's side, that things can always continue without a Russian response or an escalation. But it also tells us that what we assumed at the beginning of the war as red lines from Russia's side are not what actually Russia's red lines have been. And we have to be very careful to not fall for bluffs from the Russian side, but we also have to be very careful to get red lines analytically right. It's not something that is there consistently. It's something that changes from case to case. It's something that we don't even know to what extent those red lines are fixed, sort of formulated in a fixed way by Vladimir Putin himself, to what extent his own red lines are changing, to what extent it's changing depending on the circumstances. Again, in February 2022, everyone, you would have suggested that Ukraine does an incursion into Russia until Kursk, would have said this is the recipe for nuclear war. Again, it does not happen, has not happened. That doesn't mean that it will never happen, but it also means that we should be humble with what we know about red lines, how we base our policy and how firmly we base our policy on those assumptions of red lines. And we should be much more flexible in thinking about how red lines are local, how they're context dependent, how they have changed since the last two wars. And again, clearly distinguish between what are the red lines that are based on Russian bluffs that Russia wants us to believe are red lines, what are the red lines that are based on our own domestic constraints, which is also the fact, I mean, there are budgetary constraints, there are military constraints from defense ministries and so on, and those can be used to justify red lines. Escalation concerns do domestically not always have to be real escalation concerns. They can also be a pretext for other reasons why countries don't want to do something. And so I think this kind of debate which assumes that we know what Russia thinks, we know what is acceptable or not acceptable for Russia, what will never be acceptable for Russia. I think especially with a historic perspective, we have to be even more humble, knowing how things have changed in the past 30, 50 years of Russia. Things can change in the future. That's not something that we can determine for now. What we have to think about now is, if we take into account red lines and we arbitrarily set them where we think they might be, where do we set them that we get the best policy outcome, instead of making this war a war that is prolonged in the future, because certain red lines are limiting Ukraine's ability. And I think, again, we see this very successfully with the Kursk offensive, even if it is not militarily successful, because Ukraine's eastern front line might become weaker. It has increased the negotiation pie, let me call it that way, that Ukraine has at its disposal. Now Ukraine can come into talks, any future talks with Russia, and say, well, good, if you keep this territory under control, we can exchange Russian territory that we have under our control. And that is sort of making the pie bigger and thinking about ways how to compel Russia to be willing to make compromises. Those are the creative ways we have to think about it, taking into account how fluid red lines have been in the past and how fluid they also will be in the future.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a very interesting discussion. I think we will continue in this track. I'll give the word to Zach and Justin. And I think there are two main elements that stand out here. So the one is classical deterrence strategy is don't show weakness, don't show you're afraid of escalating. And the second one, Russia's red lines are never clear. You can always, none of the evidence so far in the war has showed that Russia is really willing to escalate to a level that NATO would fear. How do you respond to that? I would give the floor to you, Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, we know we're in a nuclear minefield. We've been here for 2.5 years. Should that reassure us, or should we still be anxious? I mean, I think that's a fundamental question. I don't like being in nuclear minefields. I think it's bad. Even if we're halfway across, we know it's a minefield. There are mines somewhere. And it's very discomforting not to know where they are. That's uncertainty is partly how deterrence works, by the way. Secondly, we're not in a classical deterrence scenario. That's a problem. We're in an extended deterrence scenario. And during the Cold War, even when the stakes were much higher for the United States, we had a hell of a time figuring out how to do extended deterrence. And I think the diplomatic history from that era shows that we were luckier than we were smart. Now, I think it's better to be lucky than smart. But this is a very witchy thing. It's not a classical deterrence scenario. And the reason extended deterrence is a problem in this case and in other cases is because the question about an imbalance of interest, right? We need to signal to Russia that we believe we have an interest in Ukraine as strong as the Russian interest in Ukraine. That's a hard argument to make. The reason it's a hard argument to make is because it's not true. So we need to trick the Russians into believing, or either trick ourselves into believing, that the United States of America has as powerful an interest in Ukraine as Russia does. And I don't think we're going to be able to do that.
Thank you. I would like, before I give the word to you, Zach, maybe Thomas, you want to come in about the extended deterrence as opposed to classical deterrence. What does it mean?
Well, of course, it is not a classical deterrence case. And of course, this issue about extended deterrence and how to balance all those interests between great powers, even extending these assurances about that we are ready to defend even our allies, first of all, in NATO. And Ukraine is still outside the sphere of extended deterrence. So this complexity, how to deal with the deterrence of Russia and having Ukraine not as a full-fledged ally here, to say in NATO or just beside the United States, of course, this makes these issues much more complex. And I fully agree that all those calculations when it comes to extended deterrence, and especially the deterrence in the case of Ukraine, which is even farther than extended deterrence. This is the real issue why I think this all these decisions and steps towards prospect of NATO membership is so slow and so ambiguous.
Please, Zach, isn't it true that Russia's red line are never concrete?
Yeah, Henrik, just to respond to those 2 points that you raised. So first of all, on red lines, this is another one of these debates in Washington that unfortunately has gone on for far, far longer than it should. The fact is that just because red lines can shift doesn't mean that they don't exist. And the reality is we're not going to know where Russia's red lines are until we've crossed them. And by then, we don't want to be in that scenario in the first place. So I think this is just a really circular discussion, unfortunately. As it relates to the question of deterrence and whether or not, let's say that Tomas is right, and that we should have upped our game earlier in the game. And we should have, basically made it very clear that we were prepared to escalate as well, and don't mess with us because we're potentially crazy. Even if that's the case, it's too late now. We've already telegraphed what our intentions are surrounding Ukraine, with the odd comment by the likes of Emmanuel Macron aside, saying that maybe there are some scenarios under which we have to be prepared to put Western troops on the ground. By and large, even that was shut down immediately by a number of other governments in the West. So we've made it very clear at this point that we are not prepared to fight for Ukraine to the same extent as Russia is. And so, if we say that, we can up the game somehow by just bringing Ukraine into NATO, the minute that we do that, that's not going to be credible. Russia would obviously immediately want to test the credibility of our commitment to Ukraine by prodding in one fashion or another. And if Article 5 is invoked in a situation like that, we have two options. Either we can have a direct war with Russia and invite a direct great power conflict and World War III in all likelihood, or the credibility of Article 5 across the board, across the entire continent, will be shattered. So I don't know why that's a scenario that we want to put ourselves in if we are proponents of Atlanticism at the end of the day. So that's what I'd have to say about that. On the issue of Ukraine's ability to join NATO, let me just say one more thing, which is that the only scenario in which this could have been a realistic prospect is one in which we had a genuine commitment by all parties, by Ukraine, by Russia, and by the West, to building a genuine cooperative security architecture in Europe. And we never had that. We had mutual recriminations, we had finger pointing, we had the West continually insisting that Ukraine had the right to choose to join NATO, over Russia's objections. That is not the spirit that underwrites a pan-European security architecture based on the principles of indivisible and cooperative security. So if we weren't prepared to be genuinely committed to cooperative security from Vancouver to Vladivostok, then making efforts or even signaling our intention to bring Ukraine into NATO was inevitably going to result in a scenario where Ukraine's territorial integrity was going to be compromised. I think any fair-minded observer of the region should be able to say that that's an obvious fact, and the fact that we never put it so plainly, I think is a complete indictment of Western statesmen who've been pushing a certain type of foreign policy towards this region for the past several decades.
Thank you. That's a good bridge into the third part of this panel, namely European security architecture. But I wonder if Tomas and Liana, you have something to comment, a response to Zach and Justin? If so, please, now's the time.
I think the only part that I would perhaps say, I think the difference is whether you talk about Ukraine's membership to NATO now, and I'm not sure that this is actually what many are proposing, certainly not what I am proposing, or whether you talk about making Ukraine's path to NATO credible by giving Ukraine a timeline for membership. And again, I think it's a truism. It's not that Vladimir Putin would not end this war if that's the perspective. He doesn't want to end the war anyway. He thinks Ukraine will become a NATO member anyway. So that argument doesn't hold for me. But I think that's a crucial difference because Zach and I certainly agree that World War III is not something that anyone wants to see. But the question is if making a membership timeline, a membership perspective for Ukraine credible for after the fighting has ended can help to end the war, or will help to prolong the war. And I think that's the two parts of the debate that we find ourselves in.
Sorry, just to clarify, I don't know, where is it exactly that you get your belief that Putin believes that Ukraine is going to join NATO anyways, no matter how this war ends? That's not clear to me, and I don't think he's ever said anything like that. In fact, he's going to war presumably to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, and he thinks that he can do that. So where does that come from?
Exactly. So any scenario where Ukraine does not become is not dominated by Russia is, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, a scenario where Ukraine will inevitably become a member of Euro-Atlantic integration. So if you want an outcome where Ukraine remains sovereign and strong and independent, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, there's no Ukraine sovereign, strong, and independent that is not somehow in NATO's orbit or in the EU's orbit. And that's he made this very clear before the beginning of the war, although there were no direct talks about Ukraine's NATO membership. He quoted this as a reason for Ukraine's NATO membership. So the only scenarios from his perspective are Ukraine that is controlled by Russia one way or another, militarily, politically, and is not a NATO member, or even if there is a free and independent Ukraine without outside NATO, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, that means it's part of NATO as long as it gets weapons from NATO, as long as it gets support from NATO. That is part of the whole Western world that he has declared war with. And so I think these are the two scenarios that we can't live with. We can't live with a scenario where he thinks that Ukraine, a free and independent Ukraine, is unacceptable to him, and we can't live in a scenario where he thinks that Ukraine will be dominated by Russia under any kind of control.
But why do we have to provide a pathway to NATO membership in that case? Why can't we explore other formulas that ensure Ukraine's independence and security, but that don't involve a pathway to NATO membership?
You have 15 seconds.
Other formulas have not worked so far, and they are unlikely to work.
All right. We have 5 minutes left, and we still are only touching on the very difficult issue of a European security architecture. I guess the overall question is, what about a model in which Ukraine as it exists, joins NATO, and Russia is given territorial concessions. So it could also be that Ukraine doesn't formally want to concede territory. So it would be the West Germany model, whereby Ukraine commits not to retake the territories by force. So like what West Germany, similar to West Germany's situation in the Cold War. Let's take a round, everyone, responding to this question, if you think that's a viable path in the future. Maybe you, Justin?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that, you know, the one thing that the other side, I think, not just on this panel, but generally and here in Washington, thinks that I agree with is Russia wants to reserve the right to bully Ukraine. That's in big part what this war is about. So I might, if to drive a wedge issue between, I guess, our side of the debate here, I doubt that there is a sustainable European security architecture that can both satisfy Ukraine's security and preserve Russia's ultimate aim, which is the prerogative to be able to bully Ukraine. Right? I think this is just a fundamental zero-sum trade-off. You know, there's a famous Mexican writer that said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." And this is just how great powers do business. I think it's unfortunate. You could call it tragic, but it's not inscrutable. And so I'm very willing to grapple with the fact that I think Russia wants to preserve the right to bully Ukraine if it wants to. And I think it thinks that Ukrainian NATO membership and U.S. troops potentially on Ukrainian territory are an impediment to that goal. And I don't have a solution for that. I mean, I think it's like, you know, we're essentially trying to obviate secular facts about Europe. Ukraine's geography, its population, the size of its economy. I mean, this is just a nightmare scenario. Again, we're just like pushing in the face of all of these immutable facts. And I just view it as kind of a tragic situation. I don't fault the Ukrainians. I don't fault the Balts. But I reserve the right in the great tradition of American agency to say no.
Thomas, maybe what do you think about the solution? Ukraine concedes territory formally or non-formally, but it then becomes member of NATO. Is that a path forward you see in the future?
It could be. Yes, it could be. And I think that this kind of scenario could, at least for a considerable period of time, just to help to maintain the balance or to help to stop another wave of aggression from Russia. Because if we are holding on this position that, okay, we can agree that Ukraine is not a priority for the United States and we are not ready, the Americans are not ready to fight for Ukraine in such a capacity as Russians do. So then we can come to the next question. Would Americans fight for the Baltic states or for Poland? Because it is also the same very tragic geography. And if we are talking about the Baltic states, we are even more unlucky being besides Russia, because we don't have such capacities as Ukrainians have. So and there's much more questions about how to defend Baltics in such case. So if we are just letting this scenario about never to include Ukraine in NATO as a kind of deterrent step for Russia, we should take into consideration what the next step for Putin will be, because there's almost no doubt that if he gains what he wants in Ukraine, he will not stop there. And I think that we have to consider how to stop him in Ukraine or just besides Ukraine.
Zach, what do you think about the idea? Or alternatively, what do you think about Ukraine or NATO giving up on Ukrainian membership, saying it's not going to happen anyway, and then making a bargain with Russia? Is that something that can work?
Well, first of all, allow me just to distance myself a little bit from what Justin was saying before, which is I don't think this is necessarily a zero-sum game. I think that it's possible to imagine some kind of formula that can meet the basic demands of all parties, especially because all parties have to realize eventually that they're not going to get 100% of what they want. So in the case of denazification of Ukraine, for example, the Russians won't be able to claim regime change as denazification. They'll have to settle for something less. They'll have to settle, for some kind of law passed in Ukraine on historical memory. They'll have to, settle for some kind of law passed, protecting the rights of Russian minorities, Russian linguistic or ethnic minorities, etc. The West, are we going to compromise on Ukraine's right to join NATO as a matter of principle? Probably not. Could we agree to some kind of moratorium, extended moratorium on Ukrainian accession to NATO or on NATO enlargement in general? Possibly. Could Ukraine agree never to recognize Russia's annexations, but nonetheless state that it's not going to try to retrieve these territories by force, perhaps similar to the Taiwan model that Mao agreed to? Possibly. Again, this is a difficult needle to thread, in part because this is a nested conflict, as I said before. But I think in principle, it's possible to reconcile some of these positions. But they cannot be reconciled if the goal is still to bring NATO into Ukraine anytime soon. There needs to be some kind of forswearing of this, if not by NATO states, then at least by the Ukrainian government, that it is going to be abandoning this its existing pledge codified into its constitution to pursue NATO membership in the short to medium term. That is something that's going to have to change. Ukraine will inevitably have to agree to limits on what can be placed on its territory as well. But that alone, the so-called Norway model, I don't think will be sufficient to get Russia to stop the fighting, because NATO membership, preventing NATO membership for Ukraine really was a casus belli here. So the key for us, I think, in any talks when they do begin, is to try for us to push for the maximum ability to develop a relationship of depth and of consequence in the military realm and in the intelligence realms between the West and Ukraine, that Russia can live with and that satisfies the desires of all parties. And the logic sort of for that, I think, is similar to what Russia did in 2008 and in 2014, right? By engaging in its interventions in Georgia and in Ukraine, it took options off the table for us. It made a genuine, realistic pathway into NATO for those two countries difficult to imagine. And so we have to find ways to compel Russia similarly to acknowledge that its maximalist goals are not going to be achieved. But if we try to push the needle a little bit too much and to think that a pathway into NATO for Ukraine is realistic, I think that would be a stretch too far. And just to sort of wrap up on this, and to respond to Liana's comment that sort of everything we've done so far in which we haven't provided that pathway to Ukraine, it hasn't worked so far. I beg to differ. Since 2008, we have been repeatedly promising that we're going to be bringing Ukraine into NATO. And this has served to aggravate relations with Russia to no apparent end, and to Ukraine's security benefit, because promising to bring them in without bringing them in doesn't actually offer them any of the guarantees of Article 5. And now it's too late. I think that if we can envisage an alternative reality, and I'm not saying we can guarantee this is how it would have been, and that any sort of negative ending to 30 years of trying to build a common European home would have been averted. But nonetheless, I think that if we had not spent the past however many years it's been now, since 2008, pledging repeatedly to bring Ukraine into NATO, I think perhaps we would have been in a different scenario with our relationship with Russia. Basically all we telegraphed to the Russians repeatedly was that, we are going to take away an important geostrategic asset for them, including a base in Sevastopol. But if they want to do something in the interim to prevent that reality from happening, in the coming years, we're not going to do anything about it. I think that was a terrible thing to telegraph in the first place. And perhaps, we shouldn't have continued to telegraph it for so long, but we continued to telegraph it in part because of this principle that Russia shouldn't have a veto, over NATO decision-making. And that's just a matter of principle. It's not a matter of strategy. But we've created this perverse situation in the European security order in the post-Cold War era where, we can't give Russia a veto, because if we do, then it undermines the rationale of NATO and the EU in the first place, because only members are supposed to have a veto, and decisions in those institutions are taken by consensus. But if we don't give Russia a veto, then every country basically in Europe now has a veto, except for Russia, which is one of the most powerful countries on the continent, which isn't exactly a recipe for stability. I think it's forswearing this that we need to be doing rather than continuing to push this idea.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes for the Q&A, so I'm afraid we need to get to those as well. There is a question from Brussels. I'm reformulating a little bit and hopefully representing it in a proper way. So it basically relates to what Zach referred to as the Norway model. Maybe Ukraine can become a member of NATO, but then a guarantee that there will be no dangerous weapons, I mean nuclear weapons, I assume, stationed on its soil. So by like a legally binding commitment. I think it's a very good question. Maybe whoever wants to respond to this suggestion is something that could work going forward. No, doesn't seem to be the case. There's a question from Antti Heiko. He asks, training, unfortunately, has always been used as a positive sign and replacement of actual serious steps since the Balkan Wars. How do you see these support actions? What is their relevance? The European Union has trained 60,000 military, but does it make a difference for Ukraine? Who wants to pick a training question? Tomas, please.
Yes, of course. On one hand, all these steps which are intended to increase the capabilities of Ukrainians, including even jet fighters. Of course, they are contributing to the capabilities of Ukrainians to stopping Russia. But it is just a part of such a softer position when it comes how we can stop Russia from aggression into Ukraine. Yes, we have a lot of instruments, from economic sanctions to training facilities and providing lethal aid and increasing our, more sophisticated weapon system we are providing to Ukraine. And still, the political posture is the same, not to stop Russia in definite way, but just to not allow Russia to move across Ukraine too fast. Russian troops are moving forward, and they will be moving forward, I guess, even faster if this aid from Western side remain the same. So training, any kind of soft decisions how to still provide any new facilities for Ukraine is okay, but of course it's not enough just to retake initiative or to help Ukrainians to regain initiative in this war. And that's unfortunate thing that we are right now observing these days.
Thank you. Liana, please, do you want to respond?
Yeah, just a very quick response to that. I think the problem that we have seen in the past with some of the sort of approaches that Europe and the United States has chosen towards the situation is that we had training that was very. I mean, we have now the training of Ukrainians. We also had a more explicit involvement of the European Union, for example, in Georgia, in the EU monitoring mission, where again Russia has not agreed to its part of the negotiation and has not allowed the monitoring mission to border its side of the borderline. And so I think the conclusion from these instances cannot be that this is what has worked in the past. If we compare the line from 2008 to 2014 and 2022, it is certainly not a line of success, but it is a line that has consistently encouraged Russia that it can move along. And that's why the future model that we have defined for Ukraine has to be substantially different from the past models that we had, either Georgia 2008 or Ukraine and Minsk 2014. And that is why thinking about this future model, one can of course discuss security guarantees, Budapest one and so on, alternatives to NATO. But in reality, none of these alternatives that have been proposed so far is an alternative that will be strong enough to deter Russia from attacking Ukraine, that can ensure the sustainability of Western support for Ukraine, And that will not lead to a situation where 2008, 2014, 2022, and the next date is perhaps 2028, where we will see a renewal of war or another aggression there. And so it is in our own interest to find a solution which is a definite solution to the security problem there, especially the Ukraine security problem, and which is not just postponing all that into the future. And any other arrangements that are discussed now, the security guarantees or security commitments now under the G7 agreement and the memorandums of understanding that have been agreed upon, that will not be sufficient. These memorandum of understandings are just codifying what European and Western countries are already doing now. So if we are honest with ourselves and if we want to end this conflict for good, we have to think beyond the models that we had in the past, because those have only led to postponing these conflicts into the future.
All right, thank you. We have 4 minutes left, and I think I'll take one last question into debate, and Justin, you can also respond to the previous one if you wanted to. The question is from Jocelyn Coulon from Montreal. He says, I believe that NATO is still in a state of brain death because the fundamental problems raised by President Macron have not been resolved. What do you think, despite the war, obviously? One quick round, 30 seconds each, please, starting with you, Justin.
Sure. I mean, I'll leave brain death alone. I think the Russian invasion has been somewhat clarifying to NATO member states, although not enough. And I just wanted to make a very narrow point on training. If you look at the performance of the Ukrainian military between 2014 and 2022, it is a profound statement to what training can do. Russia went through, if we want to even call it the Ukrainian military, circa 2014, like a hot knife goes through butter. And it probably expected the same thing in 2022. So I think training can do an awful lot. However, the inference Putin may be drawing from that is it's not just about NATO membership. It's about Western and NATO military involvement to include training in Ukraine. That's a problem. So I have some pessimism on that score as well.
Okay, thank you. Thomas, you have any reaction?
I could agree that NATO still has a lot of inside issues, and we can name it a lot of it, starting from the positions of Hungary or Turkey, from some vetoes on the membership of Sweden or whatever. So yes, NATO is still struggling to find its own agency, I would say. And that's because we still have so many countries with very different interests, and to balance all of them, it still takes a lot of efforts. But I would say that, of course, after 2022, NATO became already a stronger alliance, and at least inside NATO, at least with decisions regarding strengthening of border states like Poland, Baltics, Nordic states, NATO is becoming stronger, and I believe that even moving slower, we can solve all those complex issues inside our alliance.
Liana, do you have any last comment on the brain death issue before I need to wrap up? So like 20 seconds, if you want.
Well, the good thing about brain dead and these assessments that are coming in is that they can change quickly, and they have changed quickly to the extent that we had a French president moving from brain dead to calling for Western European troops in Ukraine. So again, a plea for the changing nature of the war and the changing context of the war, which might require adapting the Western response to it.
Zach, I give you 15 seconds. You wanted to say something?
Sure. Unity and coherence within NATO is not a panacea for resolving the dilemmas of European security, because NATO is not the only actor in the European security system. There's also Russia, and the rules-based international order is not going to be upheld just by the West. It needs to be upheld not just by continuing war, but also through diplomacy, because that is the only way that you can actually bring about a situation in which shared norms, cardinal norms of the international order are genuinely upheld. If you continue a situation in which we continue to believe that only the West upholds the rules-based international order, you're inviting continual war, great power competition, which is going to eat away at shared norms and lead to the bifurcation of international order. It's self-defeating.
Okay, thank you very much. We hope This lively debate has been inspiring. The NATO-Ukraine relationship is a tectonic puzzle in European security, Eurasian security even. We do not claim to have solved it, but perhaps move the world a little bit closer to peace and diplomacy. This recording will be available on the IPD website and on our IPD YouTube channel. We invite listeners to follow our social media accounts and IDP newsletters for updates on future roundtables. And we are, of course, deeply grateful for our panelists for having agreed to appear online on a webinar today. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Liana. Thank you, Tomas. And thank you, Zach. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.